We're now on Daf Nun Hayamid Beis, and we're trying to derive a halacha from the extra word chelkom in the pasuk Lo Seofe Chametz. Ma Talmud Lomar. The pasuk says Teofe Lo Teofe Chametz. So why does it say Lo Teofe Chametz Lo Kfar Nemar Lo Teose Chametz? We have two different psukim, and they seem to be repetitive. They're at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra. The Torah says Lo Teose Chametz. A mincha should not be made into chametz. Why do we need another lo taseh for lo teofa chametz? It said you're not allowed to bake it as chametz. Lefi shenever lo teose chametz. If we only had the pasuk lo teose chametz, yachol lo yechayev el alachas al kulam. Maybe if he does all these different peulos of lisha, aricha, and afir, he's only going to be chayiv one malchus for violating one lav. Talmud lomo lo seyofe. What is the biblical exegesis that we're doing over here? This is called a klal uprat, and the klal is going to include anything that's similar to the prat. So therefore, when we have lo seyofe, that's a prat, because afir b'chlal ha'isa, it was included under the general klal of lo te'asa chametz, and yet the Torah specifies lo te'afa. Lama yatzes. Why did the Torah have to do that? L'hakeshe leha, to make an analogy that ma afir miyuchedet she ma'aseh yechidi v'chayovet aleh b'ftei atzma. Right, the afir itself is what actually clinches the chametz. And therefore, it's a maisa unto itself. It's not just the preparation, it's the final culmination. And therefore, if you do afir without doing the kneading and the shaping, meaning let's say Reuven did the kneading and the shaping and Shimon did the baking, Shimon is going to be chayav because afir stands on its own. It's afani avili shosvei chosko maisi yechidi ba. And the prat of Afiyah is going to be Megala. It's going to reveal something about the klal, that everything that was included in Lo Te'aseh generates its own malchus. So therefore, if somebody, we said Reuven does the kneading of the dough, and then the dough rises and it becomes chametz, Reuven will get malchus. Shimon comes along, he does aricha, and he shapes the dough. Shimon is going to get malchus if that dough becomes chametz. And certainly Levi, who does the main culmination of all these peulos, namely the afiyah, certainly he's going to be chayav. Now the Gemara wants to know the following: why does the Brisa say kol ma'aseh yechidi sheba? Because up until this point, when it says kol, it's referring to lisha, aricha, and afiyah, but kol comes to include something in addition. A fourth pu'ula, lasuye kituf, shehu maisi yechidi, that even kituf, which means to smooth out the surface of the dough, that's also considered a maisa unto itself that generates malchus, because it's also part of the preparation of a beautiful bread of chametz, and therefore it stands on its own. Now the Brisa says, Chayoven oleh b'fnei atzma, so that you see clearly, not like Rish Lakish. The Brisa doesn't mention anything about the shirayim here. The Brisa is talking about the bread itself. So Gemara answers, Hanan michelkom kamrinan. It's funny that the Gemara used the word Hanan in the plural, but it's referring to Rish Lakish, and he's telling us that from the extra word chelkom, we're going to derive the conclusion that the lav of baking and leavening the bread applies even to the shirayim. So at this point, what we're saying is that the first part of the pasuk is going to serve as a klal and a prat, and the last extra word that's tagged on is going to teach me shirain. So Gemara says, wait a minute, ema kule lahachi hudiyasa. Why not say that the entire pasuk, from beginning to end, according to Reish Lakish, is coming to teach me the iser chimutz of shirayim? And the Gemara answers, im kain lichtov, it should have said chelkam lo teofe chametz. If the whole thrust of the pasuk is only to teach me that chelkam, meaning the shirayim that's designated for the Kohen, is included under the lav, then the word chelkam should have been like the introduction to lo seofe chametz. Umay, and why does it say the reverse? Lo seofe chametz chelkam shma minot tarte. So we're going to take the pasuk and split it into two. The first part of the pasuk, lo seofe chametz, is giving me something in addition to lo teos, and telling me that just like lo teofe, that afia is a maisa b'fnei atzmo that generates its own malchus, so too all the other activities, whether it be, and now we have to add kituf to kneading and shaping the dough, all each one of them generates its own chi of malchus, and then the Torah after lo seofe chametz as a prat to the klal of lo teos, and now the Torah adds the extra word chelkam. That's going to give Reish Lakish the license to derive from chelkam that even that part which is designated for the Kohen, namely after the Kmitza, we're talking about the Shirayim, that too is subject to the lav of lo seofe chametz. Frek the Gemara, v'ema afia de poret barachmana l'chayev chada ve'inoch l'chayev chada kulu. Fine. You derived the conclusion from the extra pasuk lo teofe chametz that all the other pu'ulos, all the other achanos, generate each one unto itself a chi of malchus. The Gemara says, how do you know that? Why not assume that what the Torah is doing by specifying afia, it's telling me that there's one set of malchus for all the hachanos, but afia stands on its own because of its significance as the culmination of bread, of making it a loaf of leavened bread. And for afia, you get malchus because it stands on its own. But maybe the others, only if you have all of them together and you do X, Y, and Z, only then you have malchus. And then you're going to get one set of malchus for each one, for all of them together, but not a separate set of malchus for each one. And the Gemara answers, Mishum da'avi dovar sh'hoye b'chalal. V'yotze min ha'klal l'lamed al atzmi yotze l'lamed al kol klal kuli yotze. Right, amongst Rabbi Yishmael's midos haTorah nidreshes ben, we have something called a klal and then a prat. And the principle of Rabbi Yishmael is that the prat is not just telling me something about that prat, but rather it reveals something about the klal. And the prat here is afia. And just like in afia, it's a maisa b'fnei atzmo to generate its own malchus, even though that's all he did was afia. So too, it reflects back on the klal that all the other pu'ulos, all the other actions of preparation, each one stands on its own, just like afia stands on its own and generates its own set of malchus. And the Gemara is still not happy. Amo, why don't we say the following? Lo teosa is a klal, lo teof is a prat. So far, everything is the way we said it until now. But now we're going to apply another principle. Klal uprat, ein bechlal elamasha befrat. Maybe the prat is coming to whittle down the klal and say that, and establish that the klal only applies to the prat, which means that afia in mi the achrini lo, you only get malchus for afia, but not for the others. I mean, the truth is that if we would stop right here and freeze it, it would be very problematic, because if the klal is limiting, if the prat is limiting the klal, so why do we need the klal at all? The klal is just ibrik. It's completely superfluous, unnecessary, and it only confuses us. I'll just read to you the note over here. If a prat limits the klal, why does the Torah bother to state the klal? And he quotes Rishonim that had the Torah only given the prat, it would be possible to extend it through what's called a binyan av or a kal v'chomer. But when you have a klal and then a prat, it's telling you don't even bother expanding the prat through kal v'chomer or through binyan av because ein bechlal elamasha b'frat. Omer Rav Togriki, Mishum Davi Klalu Pratam Ruchakim Zelazeh. This is not going to last very long. Anyway, he claims that if you have a distance in the Torah between the klal and the prat, then the rule is that kol klalu prat hamruchakim zemizain donin also b'klal prat. Don't ask me and raise the objection that maybe a klal and then a prat ain't b'klal amash prat. That only appears if they're one near the other. But if they're separated one from the other, like for example, in this case, you have the general category in one parsha, and you have the specific parsha in another parsha. The only problem is that the specific parsha is before the general parsha, which is going to be the objection of Rav Ada bar Ava. Mosiv Rav Ada bar Ava. I always get a kick out of that name, Ava. Is this really true? Asks Rav Ada bar Ava. Klalu pratam ruchakim zelazain donin also beklalu prat. What are we going to do with the case of tzafon? Now, what's the deal about tzafon? We're talking about the chatos of a nasi in a case where in Vayikra Perik Daled, the nasi has to bring a chatos. He has to bring a soir, I believe, if he violates an aver sheish bakaris b'shogeg. Right, a male goat. Okay. As opposed to a female goat or a sheep. Anyway, so what does the pasuk say? V'shachat oso. So you have to keep that word oso in mind, because the Gemara is going to try to pin us down and figure out what it's coming to exclude. Oso is a mute, but in any event, the Torah says that the chatos of the nasi should be shechted in the place where the ola is shechted. The heichan ola nishchetes, where do you shecht the carbon ola? B'tzafon. In the northern part of the Azor, Vaf Zebitzof, and so too, the chatos of a nasi has to be shechted in the tzafon. The problem is going to be that forget about the chatos of a nasi. Every chatos has to be shechted in the tzafon. So why did Torah have to specify the chatos of a nasi? Is this the real source for the halacha that we require tzafon and a chatos? That wherever you have to do shchita of the ola, which means tzafon, that's exactly the location where you have to do shchita of the chatos. And the Torah is equating the chatos with the ola. So once again, we have to ask the question, so why did the Torah have to specify in the case of the chatos of a nasi that you require tzafon? By saying, Asher yishchad es ha'ola lifnei Hashem chatosi, halava yotza. So Bryson now wants to know, why did the Torah have to specify the case of the chatos of a nasi, that it requires tzafon? Likovo, we have a rule in Kachim that Shino Lova Kosav Lepostel, meaning if the disqualification is only mentioned once in the Torah, that means le mitzvah. Don't do it that way because the mitzvah requires that you do it this way. But if the Torah repeats it a second time, it tells you that it's essential. It's so critical that if you don't do it, then it's possible. And therefore, if you shech the carbon chatos in the Darom, in the southern part of the Azor, for example, the carbon is possible. And that we derive from the repetition of Ola, of Asher Yishchad Ola, Mokom Asher Yishchad Ola, in the case of, in the parsha of Nos. So the Brisa now goes back and forth. Are you telling me that what? That the reason why the Torah repeated the north for shchita of the carbon of the nasi, the chatas of a nasi, is because it wants to tell you it's likuva, that it's absolutely essential. I don't know if I have to learn it that way. Or ena ella shezeh ton sofon vein acher ton sofon. Maybe the pasuk is a mute. It's not coming to reiterate the requirement of tzafon and therefore make it essential, but rather it's coming to exclude. And what's it coming to exclude? Ein acher ton tzafon. That maybe of all the karbanos chatos, only this one of the nasi requires tzafon. But any other chatos can be shechted anywhere in the Azara. Talmud Lomar, we have another pasuk. V'shachadis hachatos u'makom ha'ola. The Torah says that a chatos, and the Torah generalizes, doesn't specify which chatos. All the chatos is b'makom ha'ola, which means in the tzafon. Zebin l'chol chatos shetunas tzafon. So now we know that all chatos require tzafon, shchita in the tzafon. Later on, we're going to see the Gemara is going to vacillate as to what has to be in the tzafon, the animal or even the shochet. And the nafkami is going to be if the shochet is in the daron, but he has a long knife and he shechts the animal which is located in the tzafon, is that valid? So now the Gemara says that we have a kasha on Rabbi Aftoriki. Why? Taima, the reason why the tzafon requirement is the cause of chatos, because the Torah says that you have to shech the chatos in the place where you shech the olah. Holav hachi, apparently, if not for that pasuk of v'shachas chatos v'makom olah, havamin, I would have thought shezeh ton tzafon v'ein acher ton tzafon. We're not going to apply the principle of Rav Aftoriki of klal uprat, but rather we're going to say that this pasuk, if not for the fact that we have this special pasuk to equate chatos with olah, if not for that, we would have said that the only chatos that requires safon is the chatos of the nasi, where it says explicitly that that chatos has to be b'tzafon, meaning in the place where the olah is. And then you're going to say that every other chatos doesn't require tzafon. My timer. What's the reason for this? Lav mishum daviklalu prat v'afalgav demruchakim zemizeh. So what's your business here, Rav Aftoriki, is telling me that there's no such thing as a klalu prat if they are in different parashios and they're meruchakim? Here we have a case where even though they're meruchakim, nevertheless we're going to derive the klalu prat. And again, if you look for the prat, you'll find it in Parshas Vayikra. And if you look for the klal, you'll find it in Parshas Tzav, an entirely different parsha. And yet we're applying the principle of klalu prat. Again, to exclude anything else in the klal, because ein beklal elamasha beprat, which means that no other korban chatos requires tzafon. Again, that's all before the third pasuk. So this Bryce is a kasha on Rav Aftoriki. Maski Flor Ravashi. Ravashi says, I don't understand your kasha. Ravada, you're raising an objection against Aftoriki. There's no objection. Hi klalu pratu. This is not even a klalu prat. Pratu klalu. The prat comes first. As we said before, the prat is in Parshas Vayikra, and the klal is in Parshas Tzav. It's later on. This Rabbi Lahu, I'm sorry. So this is not klalu prat. This is prat uklal. V'nasa klal mosav ala prat. Here's where we say that the klal that comes after the prat is coming to expand the prat. Visrabi luhu kol mili. And now it's telling me that every single chatos requires tzafon. So basically, what we're holding now is that Rav Ashi has completely knocked down Rav Ada bar Ava's objection to Rav Avtariki, and now we need another explanation as to why the Brisa would, in the Havamim, if not for the third pasuk, would have ruled that the only requirement of tzafon is in the chatos of the nasi. Hello, but rather Tana Oso Kokashale. The Tana wanted to know, Rabbi told you to underline the word Oso. What is the miyud of Oso? Hochi Komar. O Eino Elish Zeton Sofon, V'ein Acher Ton Sofon, the Kos Rachmana Oso. So forget about the principle of klal that comes after the prat, is Mosif al Haprat. Forget about that. The reason why we would exclude all other chatos, again, always be, if not for the third pasuk, is because of the word oso. Oso is a miyut. Oso means this one and not another one. The chatos of the nasi requires safon, but no other chatos requires safon. That's why I need the third pasuk. The Gemara is not happy with that. See, now you had the third pasuk. And Lamaisa, the third pasuk is going to teach you that every single chatos requires shchita b'tzafon. So what are we going to do with the miyut of oso? In other words, you're telling me that because of oso, I could derive the conclusion that only this chatos is singled out for the requirement of tzafon and not any other chatos. But that's not so, because we have the third pasuk that tells me v'shachat es hachatos, which includes all chatos. So what do we do with oso? Oso lemute mai. And now the Gemara goes through, I think it's all told, 4 different possible explanations for the miyud of oso. And they give you a memory device. Number 1 is nachshon. Number 2 is shachat. Number 3 is of. Number 4 is pesach. In other words, the Gemara is going to offer 4 possibilities as to why oso is used as a miyut. The first one is going to be nachshon, because when they did the Chanukas HaMizbeach, then each nasi brought his own korban chatos, and the first to bring the korban chatos on the list for Shevet Yehuda was Nachshon, and that was a chatos li-shoah, not li-doros. And therefore also tells me that the shchita of the chatos of Nachshon, again, Nachshon is just, a shortened form of all the Nesiim, does not require tzafon. Oso and not Nachshon. Salka dat kamina hol visrabi le'inyan smicha l'srabi lami le'inyan tzafon kamash malan. We're going to soon see that Rabbi Yehuda is going to determine, based on an extra pasuk, an extra word actually, hasoyer, that the soyer Nachshon requires smicha, which is a kind of a pella because smicha is usually connected to chet. And here, this was done, these karbanos were brought for purpose of dedicating the Mizbeach. But nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that you need smicha. So if you need smicha, then basically you're taking the chatos of Nachshon, and you're placing it into the framework of all chatos. Just like every chatos requires smicha, we should therefore derive the conclusion that every chatos requires tzafon. And that's the Salka Daita Chadmina, and that forces our hand to introduce the miyud of Oso to tell me that this requires tzafon, but not the korban of Nachshon. So Gemara says, the Sanya, that works out according to Rabbi Yehuda, but not according to Rabbi Shimon, who argues with Rabbi Yehuda. And the pasuk says, "V'samach es rosh hasoyer," the extra word soyer, because in the previous pasuk it mentions the soyer. So why to repeat the word soyer? the soyer is coming as a ribui, l'rabos soyer nachshon l'smicha de Rabbi Yehuda. So everything works out beautifully according to Rabbi Yehuda, that since the Torah has a ribui for the carbon of nachshon, that it requires smicha, then I might suggest and derive the logical conclusion that the soyer of nachshon would also require safon, and therefore I need the word also to exclude it. But Rabbi Shimon Omer, and here we take a look at Daf Nun Vav, and we'll wrap it up right here. L'rabos soyer avodas kochavim l'smicha. So Rabbi Shimon doesn't use the ribui of the word soyer to include the soyer of nachshon, but rather he uses the word soyer to include the soyer avodas kochavim when there was a ruling from the High Court regarding one particular phenomenon of avodah zarah, to say that you're allowed to do whatever you're allowed to do, and that was an erroneous, mistaken ruling, and the tzibur violated avodah zarah. They have to bring a carbon soyer, and the chiddush is that soyer, according to Reb Shimon, requires smicha, even though it's a carbon tzibur, but nevertheless it requires smicha. So now everything works out according to Rabbi Yehuda, and we know that the word oso is coming to exclude safon in the case of the soyer of nachshon, but according to Reb Shimon, you can't say such a thing, because Reb Shimon is going to use the soyer not to be marbe smicha in the case of nachshon, but rather to be marbe smicha in the case of avodas kochavim. So this is where the Gemara is going to end, for the time being, at least here on Daf Vav, to tell you that according to Reb Shimon, we don't know why we need the word oso, because what's the havamini that the carbon nachshon requires safon, since it doesn't require smicha, and it only works out according to Rabbi Yehuda.
Go ahead.